So Adam Smith's invisible hand theory oftentimes is referred to laissez-faire economics. And if you remember back to day one in this second chapter, I said that I would use a couple terms interchangeably to mean free enterprise, and that included laissez-faire, free market, and capitalism. Laissez-faire really means to leave alone, and to leave them alone means to leave the individual actors and decision makers in an economy alone. Now, this also gets at the idea that something must then be impeding the actions, the human actions of individuals in a marketplace, and that's almost always the government. So Adam Smith's invisible hand theory really does call for a government that is limited, or a government that essentially lets the market operate without the visible hand of government. Laissez-faire la nature is the full context of the word laissez-faire economics, and it translated means let nature take its course. In this case, markets really are spontaneous. They really are natural. To leave the economy alone without government interference is not to say that there should be no government at all. It's simply the idea that individuals pursuing their separate interests know how to attain their goals better than the state or than state actors do. And so we should let individuals be free to make those decisions. So what should the role of government be? Well, Smith does dive into this, and he calls it a simple system of natural liberty. But in that, he really calls for three important functions of the government that we'll talk about later as functions that that markets don't do a great job providing, and thus should be left to government. I'll just introduce them here, and then we'll go into more detail much later in the last chapter of this class. But number one, private property is at the foundation of markets, so government should probably play some role in protecting or policing private property. They should also enforce contracts or promissory agreements between individuals. Obviously, we're not going to exchange things if we know that both people aren't going to be held liable for their end of the bargain. And then finally, the government should probably provide some sort of national defense in the form of a military in order to prevent citizens from being harmed from foreign nations. Okay, so the next question then becomes, when do we first see the application of Adam Smith's invisible hand theory? When do we see markets applied on any kind of a large scale, and what are the results? So the answer to that roughly comes around the Industrial Revolution. And what we tend to see, again, starting in Europe and in Britain, and then later moving into the United States, is this explosion of economic growth and human prosperity. As the video you're going to see here pretty soon explains, that a person living in 1900 had a standard of living that was unimaginable to their grandparents born in 1800, 600% higher standard of living because of the Industrial Revolution. So let's go ahead and take a look at life expectancy here. You see that before the Industrial Revolution, or right at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we see life expectancy at a really low rate, and then we see a steady uptick as markets and capitalism and Adam Smith's invisible hand really start to take hold. So let's pause for a second and watch this short video.
In the course of the 19th century, average incomes per capita in the United Kingdom rose by a factor of 6. In other words, people in 1900 were 6 times better off than they had been, or their ancestors had been rather, 100 years earlier. The Industrial Revolution was a true turning point in human history. In previous centuries, the standard of living had remained constant for hundreds and hundreds of years. It would take typically 300 to 400 years for the standard of living to improve even by as little as 50%. So to have this kind of increase in living standards in just 100 years was something truly novel in human history. Certain people in Europe, initially the Dutch and then the British, came to value trade and commerce and business highly. Instead of despising and looking down on merchants, wealth creators and traders, they began to esteem them. And as a result, a lot more talent, if you like, went into those kinds of endeavours. The development of what one historian calls an engineering culture, particularly in Britain, one which integrated pure scientific research with their practical applications in technology. This is what leads to an increasingly rapid rate of technical innovation. When you combine that with increased entrepreneurialism, what you get is a revolution in production and business organisation.
If you're a student of history, you'll notice that the Industrial Revolution on a historical timeline is a relatively, in fact, it's a brand new event in human history. And the prosperity that came with it was brand new as well. I think one of the most interesting questions since I've been a student of econ is to ask this question here. And that is, why does 1% of history have 99% of the wealth? Another way to think about it is, why is it that the period following the Industrial Revolution, which represents about 1% of all time in history, why does that account for 99% of all of history's wealth? And to answer this question, I'm going to leave it up to the experts here. And I'm going to include in this 2 videos, each of them getting at this point about how markets have really changed our standard of living, and perhaps an explanation for why, and finally maybe how the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, and markets fit into the broader context of the historical story.
The most important thing to understand about the modern world, actually, is that once people were very poor and now they're very rich. In 1800, the average person in the world made $3 a day. I mean, the modern equivalent of $3 a day. So the goods and services, the stuff you could buy in the amount of $3 a day. So 3/4 of a cappuccino per day, nothing else. In the last 30 years, the percentage of people who are that badly off in the world has fallen by half. It's been halved. So things are going very well. And for we in places like the United States, where they've gone exceptionally well since 1800, we're making, now hear this, $130 a day. And what a transformation. It's just incredible. Now, we had earned the $3 a day forever. So there was in history, if you want a short economic history, since the beginning of time, it was $3 a day going along like this. And then right here, which is 1800, it goes up like mad. And there's this fantastic transformation of the condition of ordinary folks. Why did it happen? One old explanation is exploitation. You hear this a lot. We are rich because there are a bunch of poor people elsewhere in the world who are poor. That's not true. There's always been exploitation in history, and it didn't cause economic growth. So it can't be modern exploitation. Nor can it be, to think of a more conservative way of looking at it, investment. It's not investment. It's not piling bricks on bricks or BAs on BAs. It's new ideas. It's innovation. The fantastic number of changes in machinery and materials and organizational ideas, such as the modern university or reinforced concrete. It's just amazing. That caused this hockey stick, the blade of the hockey stick. Why did this happen? 2 changes in Holland and England in the 1600s and 1700s, which was a rise of economic liberty and social honor for inventors, merchants, manufacturers. Before, these were dishonored occupations, then they became honored. And out of that came a tremendous burst of innovation that had been earlier discouraged because they weren't free and they weren't honored.
So now that we're familiar with the hockey stick effect, a neat little way to put this explosion of wealth, I think it's worth taking another look, a quick visit at this explosion of growth with maybe a more updated, visually aesthetic and pleasing representation here of what this hockey stick has looked like, especially over the last 100 years.
So here we go. First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000 and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?